Aloha and welcome to the Center for Chinese Studies webinar at the UH Manoa. My name is Jonathan Pettit of the Department of Religions and Ancient Civilizations. This webinar series is hosted by the CCS to foster interdisciplinary understanding of mainland China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, and other Chinese-speaking societies worldwide, as well as Chinese civilization and its long connection to Hawai'i. This webinar series, open and free for all, is one of the center's primary ways of engaging with scholars in Chinese studies across the globe. Today's format will feature two presentations followed by a Q&A session. So please use the Q&A tool. You should see a tab at the bottom of your screen where you can submit your questions for the speakers. And you can use the chat function, the chat tab at the bottom, for logistical issues of audio or video problems. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the leadership of Acting Director Dr. Baiyan Cheng, Associate Director Dr. Ni Zhang, and Assistant Adriana Choi. Without their tireless efforts in organizing and promoting this webinar, and it would not be possible for all of us to be gathered here today. Today, we spotlight two groundbreaking volumes published by the University of Hawai'i Press, each of which reshape how we think about religion, ethics, and reading in China. Even more special, we have the rare privilege of hearing directly from the distinguished scholars and translators behind these important works. We'll begin with the Beef Taboo in China by Vincent Goossaert, presented in English through the elegant translation of Barbara Ambrose. Professor Goossaert is Professor of Daoism and Chinese Religions at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, PSL, and co-editor of Tongbao, one of the most prestigious journals in sinology. He's internationally recognized for his work on the social history of Chinese religion in late imperial times and modern times, with particular attention to Taoism, religious professions, socio-religious regulation, and the production of moral norms. His wide-ranging scholarship has shaped our understanding of the entanglements of ritual, governance, and everyday ethics. The translator, Barbara Ambrose, is professor of East Asian religions at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on Japanese and the East Asian religions, particularly human-animal relationships, gender, and space. She is the author of Bones of Contention, Animals and Religion in Contemporary Japan, and co-editor of Animals and Religion. Her translation of Goossaert's book brings a major French language work to Anglophone audiences, balancing archival precision with clear, accessible prose. The Beef and Taboo in China explains how and why around the turn of the second millennium, Chinese thinkers and institutions determined that cattle should not be slaughtered or eaten. This taboo persisted for centuries and is still observed by some communities today. Goossaert situates the taboo within evolving Chinese attitude towards animals and meat, comparing it with vegetarianism and other ethical debates about food. He argues that its emergence must be understood in relation to agricultural economies that protected plow cattle, sacrificial reforms that eliminated beef as an offspring, and Daoist rituals and moral theologies that elevated the taboo into a cornerstone of Chinese civilization. Our second book is Literature for Little Bodhisattvas by Natasha Heller, Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. Professor Heller is a leading scholar of Chinese Buddhism with research spanning both the pre-modern period and the contemporary era. She is also the author of Illusory Abiding, The Cultural Construction of the Chanmeng Zhongfeng Mingpen. Literature for Little Bodhisattvas, published by UH Press, argues that Buddhist picture books should be recognized as a new genre of religious writing that reframes Buddhism for both children and adults. Surveying Taiwanese Buddhism from the ground up, Heather shows how changing family dynamics made children into a crucial audience for Buddhist education and transformed the home into a key site of cultivation. By taking picture books seriously as part of the Buddhist textual tradition, she demonstrates how they engage canonical sources while innovating for modern audiences. Her close readings of text and image trace narrative themes about Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and connect them to broader visual cultures in which values such as cuteness are articulated. Across both presentations, we hope that you will take away a sharper image of how everyday practices such as eating and reading become sites where religious values are formed, contested, and lived, along with new models for integrating legal, economic, and ritual evidence into the study of Chinese history. You also gain insights into the craft of translation alongside fresh teaching materials that connect dietary debates and children's didactic tales to contemporary issues of sustainability, animal life, education, and moral cultivation. So CCS, we're very grateful to Professors Goossaert, Ambrose, and Heller for sharing their expertise, and to all of you for joining us. As a mahalo, the University of Hawaii Press is offering a 30% discount on today's featured titles with the code 30SPEC. I will put that in the chat, so you can use that, and that will be, I think, valid for at least 3 or 4 more weeks. So if you don't purchase today, it's not too late. Ekomomai, let's begin.
So let me share my screen, and I think Vincent is going to begin.
Yeah. So I'll start with warmly thanking the CS and Professor Petit for moderating and organizing this occasion to talk about this book, and also Professor Ambrose for having translated it, and then she was going to tell the story of this translation. But I'll start briefly with commenting on the image that was used for the book cover. This visually striking image of actually a water buffalo drawn with a poem. So the body of this animal is actually a text. So it's a very interesting way of thinking about animals, both as real animals and as textual animals. I mean, cultural constructions of what animals should be. And the text is a lamentation. It's a plea by an aged water buffalo who has been working very hard for the farmer who owns it for many years, plowing the fields, allowing him to harvest rice year after year. And when the water buffalo gets old and he's not strong enough to continue plowing the fields, the farmer is considering selling it to a butcher so they can get a little bit of money to buy a new, younger draft animal. And the buffalo is pleading with his master, telling that he should repay the favor it has done to him year after year, working hard with in the fields, and asking him not to having butchered, but instead allowing him to live, to die a natural death, and then be buried in the fields rather than being turned and is cut into pieces and sold to beef eaters. It's quite rare in the Chinese tradition to have animals talk in the first person, as this is one striking example. And this is actually a very common image. It was mass printed in late imperial times and pasted on walls so that everyone could see the image and read the text and think about the fate of draft animals and when cattle in particular, such as this water buffalo. I mean, the water buffalo is more common in southern China when they work in irrigated paddies, and the oxen, Daoist, is more common in northern China. These are two different species, but they were considered by the Chinese as one larger coherent category, not one species, but one type of animals, and they had similar attitudes to them. So this was very common as an image, and it was seen by many Western travelers in China in late 19th and early 20th century. So by that time, it was commonly known that there was this strong, powerful discourse that cattle are a very specific species and that we should not eat them and we should not slaughter them. We should treat them as friends and walking companions. So it was quite well known by the time, but this has been to a certain extent forgotten by both the general public and scholarship. So the whole idea behind the book which was first published in French in 2005 and then translated by Barbara and published last year. Well, not actually this year, this spring, was to put this powerful tradition of talking of cattle as a very distinct and specific species back to the center of our discourse about human-animal relationship in China and ethical discourses about what humans can or should do with their non-human, with non-humans living among them. Okay, so with that introduction with the image, I'll hand it back to Barbara.
Okay. Thank you, Vincent. So I was fascinated by Vincent's book, and my interest in translating this book came out of both my research interests and also my teaching. When I was reading it, I thought, oh, really, I have to share this with my students. But unfortunately, the book was only in French, and my students, they should read French, but they don't. So I approached Vincent to see if he would be interested in working with me to have the book translated, and he agreed. I thought it was a particularly important book, not just because of my teaching interests, but also because I'm currently working on a project on life releases of Fangshang, or in Japanese Hojo, in early modern Japan. And as I was working with the texts from that time period, I stumbled about a subsegment of these texts that really talked about not killing cattle. And let me show you some images that actually, let's see, here we go, also relate to some of the contents that's covered by Vincent's book. So one of the important texts that was used to spread the beef taboo was Injuan, which was also transmitted to Japan and then rendered in both Sino-Japanese and then eventually also in the vernacular. And you can see here the important phrase in the Chinese, the Sino-Japanese text, don't kill plow cattle. And that gets rendered in Japanese, you shouldn't eat beef or venison, even for medicinal purposes. So this was showing up already in the 1700s in the text that I was using. And that was interesting to me because often in the Japanese context, the Japanese like to distinguish themselves from others and other Asians. And one of the things that they often did was to sort of claim that the Chinese ate a lot of meat and they didn't. And so the not eating beef is sometimes in the Japanese context construed as something being quintessentially Japanese, when it isn't just about Japan. Another thing that happened towards the end of the 18th century and then early 19th century is that there were initiatives in Japan first by individuals and then by people collectively to rescue cattle. So this is an early instance of one text from 1816 that shows a woman, the woman Isa, who has rescued a black ox together with her husband, and she is upheld as this moral paragon in a long tradition of other moral paragons who have rescued cattle. And eventually, in the early 19th century, particularly in conjunction with some droughts and famines, there were initiatives to establish cattle sanctuaries, particularly in Western Japan. And this is an example of one of them, some of the promotional literature that was used to promote these cattle sanctuaries. Long before there was an impact from the West to establish shelters. So these were just efforts by people who used texts like Injuan to justify why cattle should be spared from slaughter. And then one last image here is actually an image of a cattle sanctuary, what that might have looked like. This is an example from a cattle sanctuary in Osaka that was founded in 1847. And you can see here the people who are pointing, looking at the cattle, and there are horses and cattle in the pasture and in the cowshed being fed, and while petals are falling from the sky. And the caption says, "A paradisiacal sanctuary for old cattle and horses." So I will finish my last slide with the full image of the calligram that Vincent introduced, and maybe he wants to say a few words about the rest of the text.
Yeah, thank you so much, Barbara. Actually, when so Barbara beautifully translated the book from 20 years ago into English. We also it's not purely translation of the original, but we also made some updates and additions to it, and one of those well, improvement or expansions on the French edition in the English edition is having more material related to morality books. That's an important aspect of the history of the taboo, because morality books, or shanshu in Chinese, is has been since the maybe 11th, 12th century, and even more so, more massively so, since the late 16th century, when the printing industry, well, fueled by the commercialization of Chinese society at the time, with the Trans-Pacific trade, this printing industry developed very, very quickly, and lots of printed text flooded the whole of the Chinese world, and also went to Korea and Vietnam and Japan, as Barbara explained. And so one of the Interwent she mentioned is one of the most popular such morality books that laid out a vision of the good life and a vision of ideal society, and discussing at great lengths of all of the social problems that were plaguing the society of the time and how to fix them. This is a genre of literature that is still very popular today. I mean, anyone going to a Chinese temple or even Chinese vegetarian restaurant would find racks full of this free literature that offered to whoever would want to pick them up and read them. And of course, now you can find them online as well in multiple websites. And in this vision of the good life and the good society, care for animals, and cattle in particular occupies a very important place. So this was already discussed in the original French book, but now there is a much expanded discussion, including a discussion of 7 different books that were entirely devoted to the question of the beef taboo and care for cattle, printed in China between the 16th and the early 20th centuries. And again, some of them were disseminated and read outside of China, including in Japan. So on this image, you actually, it's so the poem where the water buffalo pleads for its own life. That's the main body of the animal, but there are also some short text around it, both on top and bottom and the sides of the image. And these are extracts from those different moral texts, some of which were revealed by the gods. So this is not only an ethical discourse about humans talking about what attitude they should have towards the animals they are working with, but it's also a question of revelations and intense, especially through spirit writing, among other means. It's part of an intense discussion and dialogue between humans and gods about the predicaments of human life and society. and the gods also keep telling humans constantly through those revelations about the need they have for taking care of the animals they are living with and they are working with, and cattle in particular. Even though by the 18th, 19th century, more and more animals get involved into that discourse. So we have more and more text about the dog taboo as well. So dogs, keep the house and are also companions for humans, and therefore humans should treat them well and should certainly not slaughter and eat them. Equines as well, horses, mules, and donkeys, frogs that eat mosquitoes and therefore protect us, and eels and turtles, which are closely associated with a major Daoist god, Zhenwu, or Xuetian Changdi, the martial god of the northern direction, who is also very closely associated with the emergence of the beef taboo, right? So with this, to explain the emergence around the 10th, 11th century of the taboo and its growing into a major element of what the Chinese say about their core values and their own civilization, and why their civilization is more advanced and superior to other civilizations, that they respect the animals in general and cattle in particular. So the history of that discourse about the beef taboo being a core element of Chinese civilization is such a complex phenomenon that it should be explained from different angles. There is no monocausal explanation for it. So there is both the socioeconomic development, the fact that the large estates that were that had pastures for large herds of cattle in medieval times up to the end of the first millennium disappear. And hereafter, it's China is basically a society of small farmers who don't have pasture land and can only own one or maybe maximum two cattle for plowing their own fields. So that's one element, right? So the purely human socio-ecological history of human society, but it's also at the same time the story of humans' relation with the gods, and God explaining that they don't want to be given beef as sacrificial meat anymore because beef is sacred. And so rules of purity, the kind of things we can or cannot do or can or cannot eat when we approach gods and ancestors and other invisible entities, is also a major part of that story. Right. So the different chapters in the book try to tell this history from those different angles. Maybe one more sentence before I wrap it up. There's much more to be done to explore the history of this phenomenon, and this is becoming a vibrant discourse. At the same time as Barbara's translation of The Beef Taboo in China came out, another book came out on a similar topic by our friend Meir Shar at Tel Aviv University, called Kings of Horses and Oxen, which focuses on the Buddhist side of the history of human relations with equines and bovines, and especially the beef taboo. So he has a quite different take on it. So this is becoming a multivocal dialogue about how to understand human relations to animals and cattle in particular in the Chinese context. So this is becoming an ever more complex and multifaceted discourse. But there's more work to be done, especially in terms of really looking at the interaction between the real humans and real animal, and history, and also ethnography of the kind of relation that take place when actually human and cattle live together. Because most of those books, both the Beef Taboo and so Meir's book, mostly look at normative discourses by gods or humans. We talk about what we should do with cattle, but there is more work to be done about what people actually did when they lived together with cattle. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Next, we'll take that Professor,
we are, we are within time.
was it?
We are time.
Oh, you still have time. You still have time if you want, yeah.
No, it's okay. I mean, just
Okay.
worried of having gone over time. So, yeah.
No. That's
And
perfect.
perhaps one thing I just wanted to add, I said that the discourses about the beef taboo were also transmitted to Japan, but they're presented a little differently because people were less concerned with sacrificial offerings of cattle and eating beef than they were with killing cattle prematurely. And the big issue was what to do about leather that was needed in society for various kinds of things and was usually only produced after the animals died. So the beef taboo took a slightly different shape in Japan than in China, but some of the main elements were really borrowed from the Chinese discourses.
Okay. Thank you both so much. And we're going to let Professor Heller take the floor now. A friendly reminder to the audience, if you have questions, that there is a question and answer tab at the bottom that you can put questions in. I will help make sure that the speakers see those. Okay, Dr. Heller.
Thanks so much for inviting me to talk about my book today, and to all the people affiliated with the Center for Chinese Studies to make sure that this runs smoothly. I wanted to start today with two questions that I address in the introduction to my book, and which I think help set up the study of Buddhist picture books as a fruitful and important topic. The first is, what do picture books want? In their material forms, picture books elicit bodily and sensory engagement. In the way that they ask readers to do something, picture books are actually quite like Buddhist sutras. Charlotte Eubanks has described the common injunctions to readers as, quote, what a sutra wants. And this list for pre-modern sources typically includes listening, accepting, upholding, reading, reciting, and expounding. This is a different kind of reading than what we are accustomed to in the modern West, one that is less focused on the acquisition of knowledge and instead invested in the transformation of the reading subject. Picture books likewise prompt readers to a series of encounters with the text that use different senses. A list of what a picture book wants would include listening, reading, holding, viewing, touching, and sharing. In Buddhist picture books, for example, readers are asked to listen to the words of a bodhisattva spoken by their parent. The phonetic markers next to characters help children read themselves stories drawn from Buddhist scriptures. The books can be thick cardboard for young hands to hold, or young viewers may view glossy illustrations whose colors and detail create imaginative worlds. The illustrations invite touch, for example, through games that offer explicit prompts to trace a path for a Buddha. The inclusion of prefaces and other guides show that books are meant to be shared by adults and children. What one can do with the picture books reflects the importance of its material form. That material form creates a space for the interaction of two or more embodied persons. Through reading picture books together, parents and children learn to share attention, a skill that has moral and ritual implications. Although the literature on shared reading, used from the cognitive science perspective, emphasizes what happens to children as they are read to, namely, they learn how to pay attention in particular ways, something is happening to parents as well. They may feel positive emotions about reading to their children, but parents may also be refining their own understanding, both of their children and of the story at hand. Shared reading as a repeated activity structured by physical objects and bodily interaction overlaps with other types of family rituals. The act of reading is a Buddhist picture book together is something that I have termed affinity work, creating affective connections that will continue to develop over time. So this brings me to, what do picture books do? Affinity works lays the groundwork for later connections, providing the possibility for encounters that feel fated. In chapter 6 in particular, I look at several picture books depicting family conversations and argue that these interactions do not so much teach children about Buddhism as bring it into the space of the family, creating links to Buddhist traditions and institutions. Parents do this alongside of the routine activities of homemaking and child rearing. They also engage in affective labor, those efforts to create certain kinds of positive emotional states within the home. In my book, I argue that picture books are a literary genre that forges connections to Buddhism that will be developed throughout childhood. They are the material form of a specific kind of domestic religious labor that I term affinity work. Not only are picture books part of affinity work, they are indeed the material affordances of that work. The purchase or acquisition of this children's literature creates connections to Buddhist organizations. Within the home setting, reading these books is both part of childcare and the effective labor of homemaking. It also generates loose ties that extend outwards from the nuclear family. Affinity work is processual, but not completist. It aims not for a particular credential or endpoint in religious development, but rather for a deepening nexus of Buddhist meaning created through repeated interactions. This is the iterative process that picture books encourage as well, with each reread thickening associations and meaning making. The development of these affinities facilitates reading everyday experience through a Buddhist lens and eventually acting in Buddhist ways. That picture books have a dual audience allows us to see how affinity work is part of adult formation as well. By creating Buddhist affinities for the family as a whole, caretaking adults also deepen their own sense of connection with Buddhism and their own ability to interpret the religion for their families. To explain affinity work a bit more, let me recount an anecdote that appears in the introduction of the illustrated scripture of 100 analogies, the illustrated by Yu Jing, and I discussed this in chapter 2. This anecdote, I think, allows us to see how childhood connections can then play out over a lifetime. So the author of the introduction, Zheng Shiyan, relates fond memories of being taken by his mother as a child to worship at a temple, and there hearing stories. It turns out that those stories were told none other than the very eminent monk Xingyun, whose organization is publishing the books that Zheng's prefaces for. Zheng explains that later in life, he started reading the Baoyu Jing in vernacular translation, at which point he discovered that many of the stories he had heard when he was younger were indeed drawn from the scripture. Yet further into adulthood, he finds himself arguing for the scripture's value for both adults and children in the preface to the illustrated version. So Zheng has had at least 3 encounters with this scripture, each from a different perspective, and leading over time to a deepened appreciation of its value and meaning. Zheng's mother provided the initial connection to the scripture by bringing him to the temple, which led to a recognition the next time he encountered the text. Zheng experienced a kind of proto-affinity work. Both his mother and Xingyun acted in ways that would foster later appreciation for the stories of Baoyu Jing, and they did so in relatively informal ways. But think about the ways in which a child encountering a Buddhist picture book has a different experience. Instead of at a temple, he or she likely reads it at home or perhaps in a library. Instead of a monk telling the story, a parent or grandparent might read the book aloud, and the child would have an opportunity to read it again at a different age or even on the same day. The parent or grandparent who brought the book home to the child likely recognized it as a Buddhist scripture, or at very least as a storybook with good moral lessons. And the book becomes part of an ongoing instruction in character development. What differentiates this from Zheng's mid-century hearing of tales is that it happens within a non-institutional space, the home rather than the temple, and that parents are most central to connecting the child to Buddhism. The picture book brings religion into family or domestic space. So what is the kind of Buddhism that we find in picture books? I'd like to summarize by talking just a little bit about what I cover in each chapter. First, though, I want to emphasize that I take picture books seriously as literature, even though the bookshelf here looks very different from what we might think of as a library of Buddhist books. I look for the ways that these picture books are in conversation with earlier Buddhist sources and with the broader culture in which they have been produced. Picture books are a legitimate and important source for the academic study of Buddhism, I argue, showing us how Buddhist stories, concepts, and values are translated into new contexts. So I think picture books are worth studying in their own right as one of the many sources that give us insight into contemporary Buddhism. But I'd actually like to go further and argue that the unique attributes of picture books, as opposed to texts exclusively for an adult audience, can tutor us as scholars in ways that parallel how they train their target audience of children and their parents. First of all, picture books explicitly combine the textual and the visual while attending to the material form. Given that Buddhist traditions have always drawn on these multiple dimensions, picture books are yet another source that allow us to get beyond text as content and to see it as a materially situated form. Second, picture books address multiple audiences and so compel us to consider how Buddhist sources might address different ages, social positions, and family status. Third, and perhaps most importantly, picture books also ask us to pay attention to the act of reading, how it is shaped by material affordances, how it is a part of social relations, and how it relates to the world outside the page. So the first chapter discusses when and how picture books emerged in Taiwan. In short, there are three key conditions: the growth of Buddhist organizations that produce a wide range of media to promote the Dharma. Second, the late 20th century changes in family life and parenting that created the audience for picture books. And third, the importation of Western picture books to provide models of a new kind of children's literature in the post-war period. In each of the six chapters following the introduction, I focus on a set of exemplar texts from 4 major Buddhist organizations. So the second and third chapters examine how Buddhist literature has been adapted into picture book form and how these adaptations offer interpretive strategies that can be deployed in everyday life. So in chapter 2, this is one of the books that I talk about. It's Xing Yun's picture book Heart Sutra. And I show how it initiates children into the intellectual and affective practice of reading Buddhist texts and commentaries, anticipating that this will be an iterative process, while also teaching them to read non-Buddhist texts through Buddhist perspectives. In chapter 3, I focus on Xuanzang. And there I recognize that this monk has had a long and popular appeal. Reclaiming the monk from his fictional representations is, for Buddhist organizations, an important part of what these picture books do. So they modernize him in clearly Buddhist ways. Depiction of Xuanzang's journey show the monk as exemplifying the qualities necessary for achievement in the 21st century. So this is actually another model of Buddhist interpretation, taking a historical figure and rereading him for relevance to the modern world. Locating positive qualities in Buddhist sources is another way to argue for Buddhism's continued value and importance. The 4th and 5th chapters look at how children themselves are depicted as Buddhist. Through close readings of picture books about naughty little monks, some of them are in this book, I argue that this type of character contrasts with exemplar literature to create a Buddhist path that is accessible and developmental. Imperfect children are shown as capable of change and growth, and their stories encourage empathy towards those who make mistakes. Although the childlike mind is itself valued for its authenticity, these stories also emphasize the iterative process of Buddhist learning. Chapter 5 traces a shift in the representation of bodhisattvas, from an older model in which the bodhisattva or Buddha may be eminent in the world but not part of a children's lived experience, to a modern one in which the bodhisattva is friendly and approachable. Through both the visual idiom of cuteness and child-centered narratives, these picture books show bodhisattvas and Buddhas as companions to children as they develop agency as independent Buddhist persons. The 6th and 7th chapters consider how Buddhism intersects with the social worlds of Buddhism. Chapter 6 shows how the picture books published by the Incense Light Shanguang organization treat the home as a site of religious instruction for children. I argue that including both younger and older voices, what is called cross-writing, makes these books as much for adult writers as they are for children, or adult readers as they are for children, therefore empowering parents to act as Buddhist teachers. Finally, chapter 7 focuses on picture books from the Tzu Chi Foundation, examining how they extend their Buddhist understanding of medicine and environmental stewardship to young readers. In this group of books, and this is the last book, last in time, that I discuss, and it's a book about the COVID virus. So in this group of books, the Buddhist authors and publishers prepare children to be ethical actors in their world. And as the topics of these books move from the external world of the natural and human environment to the health and morality of the body of a child, they grow more Buddhist in emphasis. So taken as a whole, the picture books I discussed demonstrate how Buddhist traditions can be reimagined in new genres. And just as importantly, that those new genres offer interpretive strategies that shape how both children and adults understand what it means to be Buddhist in the modern world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So great to hear about both of these books. Here in a second, I will repost the discount code, but I hope if those of you in the room earlier that you're inspired to go out and read these books already. Wait for Vincent to come back here, and then just have yeah, to the audience. Again, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom. So a few of you have already asked some great questions. So continue to ask questions that you may have. It's easier to ask them now while they're fresh on your mind. So please go ahead and put them there, and I will help deliver those to our authors in just a second. But maybe before we turn to audience questions, I can ask some of my own. So maybe go back to the Beef Taboo first. So questions for Vincent and Barbara. First for Vincent, you talk about the taboo as a civilizational marker, kind of a flashpoint with encounters with Westernization and nationalism. So what does this reveal about how Chinese culture is constructed through food rules today even, right? As the debates, as you mentioned, the dog and beef consumption, the halal spaces, food nationalism. So I guess just all these questions in some ways are, since our audience is from all areas of Chinese studies, like trying to think of directions that this book may take us in the study of China. So how might this study refine Chinese studies to approach ethnicity, urbanization, kind of state policy? It's like so you do this like towards the end of your book, you kind of get into these ideas of food identity and the politics of culture. So can you just speak a little bit more about that? And
yeah, thank you, Jonathan, for this. Well, historically, the beef taboo in China, like many other food taboos across the world, have been maybe did not necessarily originate purely as a way to distinguish, insiders and outsiders, but have clearly taken up this role. And in both, both within the society and also in contrast to other societies, near or far. Within society, we have a clear sense from the thousands and thousands of stories, because, well, just a footnote to my comment, but this is really not something you find here and there in small bits in the literature. This is something that is really overwhelmingly present in both normative and narrative sources about how Chinese society worked in early modern and modern times. And in these many, many stories, you have a sense that the beef taboo is something that defined a well-integrated, respectable person in society. So part of temple communities, and society was organized as cultic communities, right? Communities to the local god of the village or neighborhood, to the cult of the ancestors, to the cult of the saint patrons of the trades, and so on and so forth. And as part of those communities, people observed the beef taboo, because if you had eaten beef, you were not allowed to enter the temples. And I've still seen in this century, temples with clear signs at the entry of the temple saying people who have eaten beef should not enter this place, right? So this is a marker of someone who is fully integrated within society, as opposed to vagrants or migrants or ruffians or people who are living at the edge of the society. So that's within society. And it was also as long worked as a marker defining China's Chinese identity as opposed to others, other groups maybe living within China, but distinct groups The Hawai'i Muslims are one important case. Of course, they each have their own taboo. So the Hawai'i would not eat pork, the Chinese would not eat beef, and this would be used, including in the contemporary period, as a way to confront each other in cases of tension. And this has been the case historically for many, many centuries. As opposed to, I think, early on, as a way to define Chinese versus the nomadic people in the north, including Mongols who have ruled them for over a century and a half. And then in later times, as opposed to southern ethnic groups who also used water buffaloes in the fields, but did sacrifice and eat them. And very importantly, from the mid-19th century onwards, as a contrast between the Chinese and the Westerners who were settling in China, especially in the concession ports like Shanghai and other concessions, and who early on built a slaughterhouse for cattle and were eating beef. And this was a very major point of contention between the Chinese and the Western communities there. So the Beef Taboo has played this role for a long time. I don't think it plays this role anymore. I mean, the question of how do the Chinese define themselves against, who are the others of the Chinese, this has changed a lot over the last century or so. And food has always played a role in that distinction between the Chinese and their others. But the Beef Taboo has more or less stopped playing this role of a marker of that difference. There are still people observing the Beef Taboo today. I have a number of people I know, including friends, who don't eat beef. But this has become a very private thing. They would not, boast about it or mention it publicly. But if you know them, you would know that actually they would never eat beef under any circumstance. But this is not a marker of communal identity. It has become a private thing. So there are other ways the Chinese define their identity in terms of food, but beef as more or less. It's still observed, but it has ceased to play that role of at a larger communal or civilizational level.
That's great. Thank you so much. Barbara, a question for you. So the Beef Taboo project is I think about like a triangulation between these different languages that you're dealing with, French and English, or quadrangulation with the Japanese and Chinese. So all these primary sources, how did you navigate this quadrangle? I'll call it triangulation because a quadrant, and it sounds it's two different triangulations of languages. How did working with the French and Chinese at once complicate or actually clarify choices in rendering key concepts into English?
It's a good question. I should clarify, it's actually a relationship between 5 different languages. My native language is German.
Okay.
My working academic working languages are English and Japanese. And here I am translating a French book on China. So I think that in a sense that was actually an asset, because I'm coming at it as somebody who has maybe only half a foot in the field or a toe in the field. So I have to, if I don't fully understand it, then my readers are not fully going to understand it unless they're really deeply immersed in the field. So that was, in a sense, helpful because it kept me honest. And then also, a lot of the texts, Chinese texts, some of them I'd seen, some of them I'd seen in Japanese context and seen Japanese commentaries on them. So that was kind of helpful to get a different perspective on them. And then I should say the translation was very much collaborative. I did a first translation of the text, and then there was a lot of back and forth with Vincent to make sure that my translation really rendered what he had intended accurately. And so we went back and forth a lot. And wanted to give one example, in French, the French title is L'Interdit du Bœuf, and initially I had translated that as interdiction, and that's an English word, but it is not quite as clear. So Vincent and I went back and forth how to sort of parse interdiction, taboo, and prohibition, and which word to use in which context. And there are pros and cons for any of them. And in the end, we landed on taboo because that was actually really what I think really Vincent was getting at. And so even though that word was not used in the French edition, we did use it in the English edition, and I think it made sense to use it. But as I said, it was really a collaborative effort, with Vincent really checking and making sure that I got it right.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I'll ask one of my questions for Dr. Heller and the audience, please. We've got a couple good questions in there already, so please use the Q&A tab below to pose your question. Yeah, so for Professor Heller, kind of moving in towards the end of the book, you talk about the Taiwanese Buddhist group, the Tzu Chi, and how their children's books blended scientific neutrality with Buddhist ethical formation. So sometimes foregrounding this Buddhist identity like vegetarianism, and other times submerging it, as in the dust mites. So what does this flexibility to foreground or to submerge, so what does this flexibility reveal about how religious organizations in contemporary China and Taiwan adapt to secular discourses like science? And how might this reshape how we study religion in Chinese context more broadly?
So, I mean, if I could start by saying that, just noting, the book that I kind of held up and showed I wanted to, I guess, note how sophisticated the science is in this, that, to be honest, that I learned something, actually learned quite a good deal about the COVID virus, and how how it is, the vaccines are developed and it was treated. And this book came out in June 2020, so they put this into production very quickly. And I think that's a real testament that this was part of Tzu Chi's mission that connects the hospital and the health-oriented universities there. And in that sense, I think Tzu Chi is a little bit distinct from other Buddhist organizations, that they have had this long-standing commitment both in to health and medicine, from really the beginning of the founding of the organization, and environmentalism not following not that long behind it. And so they stand out to me a bit in the way that their picture books do sort of, as you used the phrase, submerge Buddhism and then foreground Buddhism. And I think this has to do with their commitment to, if they are framing what they are doing as, compassionate aid, right, and helping the most people, that not always does that need, or not always is foregrounding Buddhism desirable in that context. So to give an example of this, they have a whole series of books that have to do with kind of public health. And they're kind of common childhood ailments and so forth. And their interest is in improving public health overall, and that they see that as a good that's in line with Buddhist values. But you don't necessarily need to put those Buddhist values in the front to achieve those ends, so that you can move that sort of line backwards and forwards. And, I think that one of the things that this points to actually is the porousness of, and I don't think this is actually, I mean, the way Tzu Chi does it, I think, is distinct, but I actually don't think that the porousness of religious discourse is distinct to Tzu or Taiwan or to Buddhism, right? That there's always been a kind of a lot of movement back and forth through, medical discourse. Like if you went back, right, I think probably in Daoist texts that you can equally find this kind of movement between sort of salvific ends and more immediate bodily benefits, if I could frame it that way. But I think it's worth always thinking about how that movement happens. So I guess I'd stop there and sort of gesturing towards an answer to your question.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, let's turn to some audience questions. So from Qijun Zheng, we have to Professor Goossaert. On the cover image of cattle, you mentioned that the accompanied text has couples prohibitions involving cattle with dogs. How should we interpret the semiotic split between iconographic specificity, a clearly delineated cattle front, and the textual conflation? So the cattle and the dogs are bracketed together. Does this pairing merely reflect a shared category of meritorious to protect animals, or does it imply a hierarchy of taboo in late imperial and modern Chinese discourse? Yeah, we'll do. And then to Professor Ambrose, Chijun also writes, has there been a discourse on dog taboo or protection of dogs in Japan rooted from Chinese sources too? Thanks.
Thank you. Should I start, maybe? Thank you. Thank you, Chijun, for this. Yes, there is definitely a hierarchy of taboos. In most cases, not very explicitly formulated as a hierarchy, but still the cattle would be mentioned first, and then other animals after that. There are some cases where this hierarchy is actually formalized and quantified. You find this is in one particular subgenre of morality books, the ledgers of merits and demerits, that assign a very precise number of merit or demerit points to each action you might do, including the way you deal with animals, such as slaughtering them, killing them, and eating their meat. And there you do find the highest numbers of demerits are accrued if you're slaughtering a cattle. I mean, more you might have, for instance, making numbers up, but like 100 points of demerit, which is a lot. If you kill or have an ox or a water buffalo killed, and maybe 50 points if you have a dog killed, and then 20 for another animal, so on and so forth, right? So you do find such ideas of a hierarchy. It's important to protect dogs and also eels, turtles, frogs, and so on, and horses and donkeys and so on and so forth. But the cattle rank first. Now, I'm not sure the way it's shown up in the image and that was used for the book cover really reflect that. I think the image, this very beautiful calligram was really about the cattle, and then people who printed it added some other text as well without illustration, because most of the space of these sheet, these were like one sheet mass printed and then given over to people and or pasted on walls. There was some little blank space left in the sheet on the corners, and so they added a few sentences for other words, some of which mentioned the dogs. But here, so it's not so much about hierarchy, but you do find the idea of a hierarchy of animals. And in some texts, the whole range of animal species are organized into meritorious and not particularly meritorious. So you're going to animals that work for us, we have a ritual relationship with, and that's the cattle on top. And then you have the other animals, and their life is also needs to be protected. Ideally, you would not never kill an animal, including ants, right? But of course, the value of ants is much lower. It has a value. Their lives have a value, but it's much lower because we don't have this ritually binding relationship with them that we have with animals we actually live with and work with. So, yeah.
Okay, in response to the question, is there something similar like a dog taboo in the Japanese case? Yes. So if you look at some of these Chinese discourses that start with legal prohibitions, going back, for instance, to the Tang Code, the Tang Code influences also legal codes across East Asia, including Japan. So similar kinds of prohibition against killing cattle, horses, dogs, and sometimes also the rooster are also found in Japan. There's, for instance, interestingly, the rooster is not very common, but an underground Nembutsu confraternity had also a particular taboo against eating chicken. So but the dog also shows up in Japanese history. It's not quite as systematically enforced as the beef taboo, as similar to China, but it does show up. And it shows up perhaps in most prominently in the case of Shogun Tsunayoshi, who's also known as the dog shogun, because of the laws of compassion that he the edicts that he issued to protect various kinds of animals, particularly dogs, horses, and cattle. Also some other animals as well, but those were the most important ones. The prohibitions issued for horses and cattle stayed in place even after Tsunayoshi passed, but the one against dogs sort of went out the window once he was no longer shogun. But what he did was he basically prohibited the killing of dogs. There were massive dog shelters that were established in Edo at the time, and some of the samurai had to pay for all this, so they were not happy about it. They also established registrations of dogs, horses, and cattle. And the dog registration didn't persist after Tsunayoshi, but the one for horses and cattle did. And then what they did was you had like these registers, and it said so-and-so bought a black ox with short hair from so-and-so in such and such a year. And then you see this listed, and then so-and-so has a horse, a piebald horse or something. So identify the fur, the length of the fur as well, to really make sure that it's the right animal. And then they had to have basically certification from the village head if the animal died, that it died a natural death, and from their direct neighbors in the five household association. They had to also certify this. So, but for dogs, that didn't last very long. And then in the early 19th or the mid 19th century, some of the people who were interested in cattle sanctuaries were also interested in dogs. So this guy, Akatsuki Kanenari, I showed you an image from one of his texts. He's also the only one to write actually a veterinary care manual for dogs at this time. And he has a larger volume with all kinds of didactic or edifying stories about dogs that he puts together at that time. And that's actually a project that's on my to-do list, to write an article about this particular work. But it's kind of like a morality book in a sense, with edifying tales, and then has a section appended with the veterinary manual, how you're supposed to keep dogs, and that you better not feed them shrimp because it makes them sick, and various other kinds of interesting things, and what to do about this disease and that disease. So dogs were kind of special sometimes, but not as systematically as cattle and horses.
Thank you so much. We're starting to run out of time, so if you have a question, you need to put it in the tab. But maybe we can take one more audience question for Professor Heller. Person writes, you argue that picture books teach children to see the world in Buddhist ways through empathy, ethics, and everyday practices. What larger implications does this have for studying humanistic Buddhism in Taiwan and China, particularly its intersections with state educational agendas, notions of citizenship, and the idea that Buddhism is education?
So I think one of the things that would be really important in to think about in answering that question or the implications is that it would be hard to understand what the picture books are doing without, like what Buddhist picture books are doing without looking at other picture books, non-Buddhist picture books, or I think especially, you know, for the notion of like what kind of educational agendas for looking at textbooks. So most of the picture books are, of course, written for children who are just learning to read. And, you know, we can kind of tell this because, you know, I mentioned sort of briefly that they'll add in like the bopomofo, right, alongside the characters. And those phonetic marks tend to disappear as, you know, students or children are expected to be able to read those texts independently. And so this is one of, just as an aside, this is one of those places that points to the kind of shared reading. That this child might be reading the pronunciation rather than the characters. And, you know, textbooks, of course, start at a slightly later age, but it does give you a sense of how expectations for children are being shaped. And so one of the things that I did in the course of this project that's sort of sitting in the background, perhaps especially of the chapter on Xuanzang, is having spent a long time in the textbook repositories in Taiwan. And that gives you a sense of how issues of citizenship, issues of, you know, what does it mean to be a model kind of person? And indeed, like the textbooks use Xuanzang as a model. Like he's one of the few figures, like he obviously when there's a section in the history textbook that talks about Buddhism in the Tang Dynasty, but Xuanzang also appears in kind of like what are kind of the equivalent of ethics textbooks or character textbooks. And there he's held up as a foreign exchange student, right? Like that's actually the term they use for him, which is a really it's kind of secularized way of viewing him. It is in some ways also reclaiming him from this kind of fantastic journey of the West image that, you know, that a lot of books reference the fact that, you know, you may think you know Xuanzang from the journey of the West, but that's not who that monk really was. And so textbooks work to kind of reclaim him. And then Buddhist picture books reclaim him as well. And they're kind of in tension both with this fantastic view of Xuanzang, but also in tension with the textbook ones who maybe want to see him as a little bit more secularized. And the book that I held up actually is one of the, and this is, you know, Xuanzang is one of the figures that goes through Buddhist picture books, but also into you know, commercial non-religious picture books. So you can see how he's represented in different spheres. So I think that part of the answer to that question is, you know, to understand humanistic Buddhism means reading against sort of the kind of cultural and social shifts that we've seen in Taiwan in the late 20th century, and seeing how Buddhism is in dialogue and perhaps going so far as to say intervening in those educational patterns. And, you know, I think we could also start to do some interesting tracings with Buddhism's response to the emergence of public education, even in the Republican period, that as soon as that starts to happen, you have the formation of a citizen in a different way that than there had been before, which gives a different space for home education, especially Buddhist inflected home education. And of course, during the Republican period, we're seeing Buddhist reformers argue that Buddhism has a place in the modern world, and part of that place could be in constructing people who could contribute to a productive modern nation, right? And women are very much part of that as the earliest educators, helping children be formed as beginning citizens. And so I think some of that essentially percolates through the 20th century, and you can see traces of it, or I mean, perhaps am inclined to see traces of it in contemporary picture books as well.
Great answer. Thank you so much. Well, with that, I think that brings us to the end of today's webinar. I really want to thank the three of you for being here, and thank you for your tireless effort to make our university press such a fine institution. And I hope that you publish more with us, and that you'll be back at a future webinar as a. But thanks again to Ni Zhang and Adriana Choi and Bayan Chung for helping us host this series. And if you're not on our mailing list, you should get on our mailing list so that we can send you our webinar series for both this fall and spring. There are a few really good webinars this fall, so make sure you check them out. And yeah, adios, que aloha.